Now this evening, I'm hoping we're going to have a lively discussion from a number of perspectives on the issue of fracking. Now it won't necessarily be huge amounts of technical detail, but I think you'll find it will give a broad appreciation of a number of aspects of the subject. So this evening we have 4 speakers who I will just briefly introduce in the order in which they're going to speak. It's firstly we have James Woudhuysen, who is a professor from De Montfort University. And then second, we're going to have a more local point of view from Professor Erik Bichard from Bichard, from Salford University, although I believe he's a resident of Liverpool, but don't hold that against him. And then we're going to have Joanne Green speaking, who works in the health sector, and I believe is going to give a perspective really from a sustainability point of view. And then we have Tony Bosworth, who will be known to some of you, who is a long-time campaigner for Friends of the Earth on the issue of energy and climate change. And what I was going to do is each speaker, hopefully, will speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we might have a couple of questions amongst the panel and then go out to the audience. However, if you're looking very agitated, I might come out to the audience straight away. So I hand over to James.
Thanks very much, Keith. Hope you can see that. I'm over Keith's head, and I wish we could get some lights down, Graham, a little bit if it's possible. No,
it's
no lights down.
Nothing. If people don't mind sitting in the dark, then I can do it.
Well, then they can't take any notes. It's a good idea. Okay, well, I think some of you will know the details of how fracking works, and I'm sure Tony, my opponent from Friends of the Dirt, as I like to call them, will help us out on that. And it is quite interesting how long it's been going on since, in fact, they first used napalm, I'm afraid to say, naphthalene and palm oil in jelly form to begin fracking in 1947, if you can see it. But I want to put a wider context here tonight for you before we get into the ins and outs, although we'll get into them quite quick, about fracking from a kind of innovation perspective is what I profess in, and I think it's too much neglected. That's really the theme of my talk. Come to the front, sir, if you're late. Come to the front. This is how natural shale looks like, complete with a pickaxe. That's a Marcellus shale in the United States. But of course, fracking, you have to go underground and do it all artificially. Now, let me just begin by saying, if you read my book, Energize, you'll find that I absolutely agree with the idea of anthropogenic climate change. Not just anthropogenic, but human-created. So we needn't argue about that. And what I'm a bit more suspicious about is the whole sort of stuff about carbon footprints. If you look up personal carbon footprints or carbon footprint calculator on Google, you get thousands and thousands of different ways of calculating it. And I was just staying for my sins in the Holiday Inn, and what did they do? But give me one of these. And I think by the time it's got to the Holiday Inn, Tony, you know, you've got to get a little bit nervous about the whole idea of the footprint. And even some reputable green sources, you know, admit that it's very difficult to calculate it in different ways. Do you think about the machinery that made the gas? Do you think about just the gas? Do you think about disposing of that machinery? All the CO2s that are involved in that. I'm a big fan of renewable energy, or as I shall call it, as we call it in the book, astronomical sources of energy, because they're very large scale. And this is a Salon, no musical chairs, I've got to tell you. Oh, that's all right, sorry. You want me to get, am I in the right there? The camera there? Anyway, I've been involved with Geothermal Engineering Limited down in the West Country, and I think geothermal is also underrated as a source of energy. So I want to say that I don't have a problem with renewables, I'm all in favour of them. Now, let me just sketch this wider context by talking about the innovation crisis in energy. This is a fellow Dutch person, I'm half Dutch, she's the director of the Rich Man's Energy Buyers Club, the international energy agency. She looks pretty happy here, But she's not that happy, because if you look at research and development in energy, it's down by 66% since the 80s. If it was 16%, I could live with it. If it's 66%, I think the IET, who are one of our wonderful sponsors tonight, would get a bit upset, and I am pretty worried about it. And if you look at the numbers, which nobody does, you'll see that if you just add up the final column in that and compare it with the first column, you'll see that R&D is way, way down. And you'll also see, if you look at the numbers a little closely, going across 81, 91, 2001, 2011, the R&D for energy efficiency is way up, now exceeds nuclear, which is way down, and renewables are actually lower than loft insulation. You remember Gordon Brown's program updating Tony Blair, insulation, 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 and there's no R&D happening to speak of in fossil fuels. That's a problem across the whole gamut of energy sources. And it's such a problem now that even Jeffrey Immelt, the head of General Electric, believes that his company has no future in nuclear energy. He's pretty upset about that. He was a happier bunny in earlier times, but now, you know, he's wiping the floor with nuclear energy. We've got to ask, well, what is really left for us? We can't have the carbon sources, we can't have the nuclear, according to Friends of the Earth, it began as an anti-nuclear organisation. Are we only left with solar, wind, geothermal, and a little bit, and some other things? Just to confirm this point, if you look at it at the company level, and you can see Shell and BP and other people in the oil business, let alone the utilities or the big six who are even worse, they're spending, in BP's case, just $2 in every $1,000 that they earn thinking about the future. That's bad news for innovation. It's the kind of mentality that led to Deepwater Horizon. So the first thing I want to say is we need to understand R&D numbers, and we need to do a lot more R&D. And the second thing we could look at, and this very much confirms the sort of complacency of what's happening in the energy sector, is the cash hoards of large energy companies. You know, Petrobras, Brazilian firm, recently announced it would spend $9 billion on cyber security because it was so upset with the No Such Agency, otherwise known as the National Security Agency, hacking into it. It's got $32 billion just languishing in the banks, earning nothing, because there's no interest but being paid on that money. They'd rather put it in the banks and earn nothing than put it in a laboratory and take a risk on innovation. That's very worrying for the West and for all of us. So it's worth checking out the cash hoards of these companies. I'm pretty grumpy about all that. Why am I grumpy? Because we face a world of rising energy consumption, not just because the Chinese insist on turning buildings into cinemas or building 7 terminals at Pudong Airport in Shanghai, but because we face rising energy consumption throughout the West, and certainly including England. And when you've got rising energy consumption and no innovation bringing about new investment, cheaper energy, more higher productivity, the result is likely to be power cuts. I was just in Beirut, and a German green came along and said, you don't want to build new energy, you just want to save it all the time, and at that moment the lights went out. So if you want to avoid blackouts in Britain, the energy gap that's looming cannot be solved, and come back to this, by cuts in energy consumption or insulation, insulation, insulation. It can only be solved by a larger and better and more productive and cheaper and more innovative energy supply. So expect more power cuts. And I just want to say finally that much of the inspiration for the fear that surrounds fracking and all forms of energy, especially nuclear, begins with a German in 1986, he put forward the sort of Australian boomerang theory of the future, that anything you do now could come back and knock you on the head in ways that you're completely unfamiliar with. And when we look at that, this sensibility to risk, this apprehension about the future, is something that happens in the health domain, it happens in the IT domain, it happens about all forms of engineering, and it certainly attends energy. Especially since the end of the Cold War, when the old stabilities kind of broke up, we find a lot of fear around innovation in general, and certainly energy innovation. The fear is so great that fracking is widely thought to create earthquakes. If you look at which happened, a couple I believe, off Lancashire with the dreaded quadrilla a year or two back, it was magnitude 2, which the geographers in Britain maintain happens at 25 times a year for natural causes. Nevertheless, we're told to believe that fracking causes earthquakes on a grand scale. So I think this fear of energy innovation as itself risk is a real problem for us, and I'm being told to wind up. That's great. I just want to say that fear, I haven't even got on to fracking properly yet, but maybe that's a good thing, set the context. That fear is going to come at the renewable sources of energy that Friends of the Earth and other people so much value. It's going to come at them very quickly. Because just in tomorrow's Scientific American, being a forecaster, I like to bring you tomorrow's news today. It's dated October the 1st. You'll see that they're already doing all the sums to show how carboniferous renewable energy is in terms of solar panels, wind turbines, and so on. The materials that go into making them are put up in this chart by Scientific American, all the silver that you need in solar panels and all of these things. So once you get onto the fear wicket, which is so much a part of Western culture since the end of the Cold War, it's only a matter of time before people discover wind turbine syndrome and all the deaths that are involved in panel making and all of these things. So the result would be that we would freeze out even renewable energy sources. When you look at how many people die in rooftop accidents in the States, for example, then that is going to come at solar panel installers fairly soon. When you look at the 1,500 accidents and 4 deaths that have happened in wind power in Britain in the last 5 years, the fears that attend fracking, which I believe to be exaggerated, they're not all unfounded, and they need careful experimenting with. All of the worries that people have need to be tested with science and technology and innovation. But the general fear mentality, a culture of fear, is something that will deny us even renewables if we fall victim to alarmism. And that's all I'm going to say to set the context. More later.
Okay, my turn. Not on.
What's on? The green light should be on.
Press it in the middle. All right. Okay. So I'm another professor. I'm Erik Bichard. I do work at Salford in the School of Built Environment. I'm a professor of Regeneration and Sustainable Development, and I'm here because part of my research is to ask questions about how it is that people organise for what we call pro-environmental activity. And it's always interested me, and I've done lots of work in different communities to try to answer the question, can we actually link global and local and do something ourselves? Because the feeling I'm getting travelling around the world talking to people is that, very few people are active who actually trust authority. That more and more people are saying we need to save ourselves here. But how are we going to do that if we don't organise in a more effective way? So, as James plugged his book, I hopefully think I'm privileged to say that I just finished a book called The Coming of Age of the Green Community, and one chapter was all about fracking, or anti-fracking to be exact. And I was across in Pittsburgh talking to the Marcellus protest, and also up in Lancashire talking to Raffinreef, and did extensive research on this. And in the process of really discovering what motivates people, obviously I got to learn quite a lot of things. I have to admit, disposed against hydrocarbons. I can't see how we can utilise them today within our own Act of Parliament and general opinion. You've probably seen the press about Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has just come out, and in the coming weeks, 2 more reports on the what's going to happen if we carry on burning hydrocarbons. So I was predisposed against, but what I discovered just really worried me even more. So in the limited time I've got here in this slot before we open it up to you, instead of talking about earthquakes, which are very real, water pollution, air pollution. I'm going to go for methane. That's not a very glamorous subject, but I think you'll find by the time I explain this that it's probably one of the most important. So, another document that Jen mentioned was the IEA report, Golden Rules for Golden Age. This was a big report, came out a while back, and it was more or less, as the title might suggest, a huge boost for the gas industry and the shale gas industry in particular. It was all about unconventional gas, and on page 92, you had to persevere, page 92, they said this: it is true that if we exploit unconventional gas, shale gas, it will increase greenhouse gas emissions, probably stabilizing, they use that word, I love that, stabilizing at 650 parts per million, resulting in a change, global warming, of 3.5 degrees. Now, I don't know if you've been following the debate, that would never sound very much to people who haven't been associated with this, but let me just mark your card. 3.5 degrees warming from where we were in 1990. That's 7 to 25 meters of sea level rise. New York mainly sits at 3 meters above sea level. There'll be super droughts. There'll be 50% increase in wildfires. There'll be probably loss of huge tracts of rainforests, including the Amazon basin. Runoff will increase by at least twice as much. And that means in places like the Indian subcontinent, there'll be too much water at some point, washing people away and killing them, and not enough in others. 50% of African agricultural output is predicted to finish. No more growing. And actually, that's between 2 and 3, that's not 3.5. So, I actually put it to people who are talking about how great this exploitation of unconventional gas is. And I say to them, I really love to find sustainable forms of energy. I'd love to top your product up. So if you can just tell me why it's okay to warm the planet at 3.5 degrees, I will talk up unconventional gas till the cows come home. And you know what they say? In fact, they actually said this to me. They get very angry. Then they say, well, if you've got that attitude, you might as well leave it in the ground. At which point, generally, the audience applauds. So, what is methane? Why are we talking about it? Well, methane is a greenhouse gas. Most of the time we talk about carbon dioxide. It's 21 to 33% more potent than carbon dioxide. It's not as much of it, but it's like putting a zillion duvets on you instead of just the one. And the reason why we talk about it is because shale gas produces 40 to 60 times more methane than many other forms of hydrocarbon exploitation. And when you look at the implications of that and add it all up, as academics at Cornell have done, you very quickly understand that because of all the leaks, all of the emissions, all of the ways that the industry doesn't take care of these wells, and the very nature of it, pushing all of those liquids down, sucking them back up again, all of that concrete cracking around the wells and all the rest of it. By the time they finish telling you this is great stuff because it's only half the emissions of coal, we finish up at actually very, very near oil. And that is just about all you need to know about shale gas. Do not believe the hype. This is not a lovely, cuddly, stopgap energy source. This is every bit as bad as the stuff we're using, and if we carry on, we will definitely not survive into the next century. Thanks.
Hello. Can you hear me okay? Does that sound I completely disagree with Erik, but I'll just carry on. Yeah, that's fine.
Any better?
Is that better? No? Hello? How can you hear me? No? I can hear you.
We don't.
Yeah? Okay, fantastic. So this is what I'm going to talk about, okay? So I'll just go on to the next one. So the climate change impacts. The British Geological Society identifies locations containing derivatives of oil, organic limestone deposits, calcite and algae from Pinoida, which is shell-based animals in the sea. They also map earthquakes, UK geology, such as shaleware, fracking gases, soil chemistry, groundwater science and much more. They have a climate change programme, and by studying historic climate change impacts, they forecast future climates. The Met Office illustrates a warming of the climate in the UK, and they also refer to USIP, and that's hosted by the Environmental Change Institute, University of Oxford. Their UK SIP, 5-stage adaptation wizard, guides organisations on why and how to adapt to climate change projections in business, and this is used achieving a climate change area climate assessment tool for standard business areas. An argument explaining why organisations are risk assessing for priority climate risks and creating adaptation plans is given in their podcast. They also have it on a PDF, which is still just as interesting. This tool guides organisations how to baseline and assess their vulnerability of the product, the site and the location. This provides case studies of branded organisations on what they are doing. In essence, what UK SIP is explaining is reversed environmental impact assessment, also known as an EIA, a future-proofing of organisations against climate change, which is what Erik didn't discuss. Directive 2011-92 EU EIA codified on the 13th of December 2011, and it's actually 10 years old roughly, is transposed into UK legislation in the Town and Country Planning, Environmental Impact Assessment, Regulations 2011. Planning applications under the Town and Country Planning Act use a National Planning Policy Framework. It is here where fracking activities may require EIAs to be considered. EIA is a systematic scoping and screening assessment. On certain public and private projects on the environment. They are mandatory for Schedule 1, which is the flowback waters, and discretionary for Schedule 2, which are the explorations and the gas and the oil. Fracking activities fall into both schedules. So planning applications in the Schedule 1 have environmental statements, and they must be accompanied by the environmental impact assessment. A project includes the implementation of installation. And IEMA, a professional body, Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, has a quality mark series detailing how EIA in multiple organisations and situations is successful. When placed into context, the sources provide illustrations of vulnerability and how to overcome those using adaptations. For this debate, they illustrate the potential significant impacts of fracking and in situ, and to show empirically that the UK has the technology and the stand to safeguard against and remove and control fracking hazards and risks. The safeguards even occur during fracking investigations because they are designed into the process and at all the stages. Sorry, I messed up my paperwork. Other advisors to the regulator. The Environment Agency and HSE 2012 document working together regulate unconventional oil and gas developments. They outline coordination of shale gas regulation. The coordination regulates all aspects of the plants, its processes and substances, and this is explained in greater deal in the documents, Memorandum of Understanding, that frameworks monitoring their liaisons, the contacts in the UK and the international scope, waters, industry, jurisdictions, installations and the construction, and also safety zones. Safety zones are normal practice in energy creation, including offshore renewable energy installations, the storage of items in EIA Schedule 2 activity. These are set out in the Energy Act 2004. and they provide detail where activities take place on the sites. That's the actual storage of all the different components that they need. The environmental permitting regulations will guard against contaminated fluid entering groundwater and the hazards presented by the fracking chemicals. Mitigation information will be submitted to the Environment Agency or the equivalent when they decide whether to permit, which permit will be required. Between 10,000 and 30,000 tonnes of water is expected to be required, so it does need to be permitting for fracking. So, and there's also going to be permits before and afterwards during the operations. DEC also monitors seismicity and working with the British Geological Survey, and we do have hundreds of earthquakes in this country. If rail links will be required to the site, these will require planning permission under Section 90 of the Town and Country Planning Act. Conservation is looked after by the Planning and the Conservation Areas Act. And these are also actually shown in the Auto Accord application if you'd like to see some of them. Where an environmental statement is required, it may be best to contact the local authority for a scoping opinion. So these illustrate that all the activities all the way through the fracking process, even during the investigations, are recorded and with a strong emphasis upon health and safety and management of those activities. And that's the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The message that I want to get across is to say that shale gas, in Friends of the Earth's view, is unconventional, it's unnecessary, and it's unwanted. It's not the answer to the UK's energy crisis. And when I'm talking about, I'm going to talk a lot about shale gas, but most of the points I make will also relate to other unconventional gas, such as coal and methane. Firstly, why, shale gas, unconventional. James said they've been fracking since 1947. The problem is that the fracking which is happening now, which they're proposing, which they're doing in the US now, which they want to do in the UK, is a novel technology. It's all been developed in the last decade. Looking at what happened in 1947 and what they're proposing now, it's like comparing a penny farthing to the bike that Bradley Wiggins rides. It's got two wheels, but then the similarity ends. There are big risks with fracking and the technology. The European Commission, not known as green extremists, have said that there are serious risks of local impacts in terms of water contamination, air pollution, etc. And despite the industry claims, there is evidence of problems in the US. The United Nations Environment Programme, again, not green extremists, has said they've reported work on the Marcellus and Utica shales in the northeastern US, and they said there is systematic evidence of methane contamination of groundwater associated with shale gas extraction. The government here would say that regulation can make the industry sort its problems out. We'll have robust regulation. One of the problems is that the body they're charging with regulation, the Office of Unconventional Gas and Oil, is also the cheerleader for the industry. We believe that regulation can make the industry safer, but it cannot make it safe. Joanne shows a real faith in the regulators, groups like the Environment Agency, and in the ability of environmental impact assessments. Environmental impact assessments that she talks about are required for projects which cover more than 1 hectare at surface level. It's very interesting that of Quadrilla's drilling sites in Lancashire, 3 of them are 0.99 hectares. She also said that all the Environment Agency will be requiring permits. We've been in there, the drilling that achieved lots of prominence in Balcombe this summer. They had initial discussions with Quadrilla and said that Quadrilla did not require any permits. We questioned that, and 2 weeks later they came back and said that Quadrilla did require 3 permits. A waste permit, a mining waste permit, and a radioactive waste permit. The Environment Agency was asleep on the job. It doesn't do a lot of faith for your hope in regulation.
Shale gas is unnecessary. It keeps us hooked on fossil fuels. I'm not going to talk about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. We've seen that 95% certainty that climate change has been caused by man's activity. They're as certain about that as they are that smoking causes cancer. The big problem is we've got too much fossil fuel already. The Carbon Tracker Initiative has said we've already got 4 times as much fossil fuel as we can afford to burn if we want to keep within climate change targets. Professor Dieter Heldt put it a little bit more succinctly. He said we've got enough fossil fuel already to fry the planet 3 or 4 times over. The International Energy Agency, quoted by James, said that they put out this report called a golden age of gas. They clarified, they said it is going to be a golden age for gas, it's not going to be a golden age for humanity. We don't need that extra fossil fuel. We should not be putting the extra effort into digging up more fossil fuel that we simply cannot afford to burn if we want to tackle climate change, particularly when we have solutions like cutting energy waste and exploiting our incredible potential for renewable energy. Shale gas is unwanted. You'll all have seen about the protests in Balcombe. It's not being opposed just in Balcombe. Around the UK, it's being opposed in Lancashire, in South Wales, in Somerset, in Kent, in Scotland, in Northern Ireland. It's being opposed nationwide. It's being opposed all across Europe. It's being opposed in the United States. It's being opposed worldwide. Josh Fox, the director of the film Gasland, has said shale gas is one of those issues that makes you realise that your backyard is connected to everybody else's backyard. The people opposing shale gas are not NIMBYs. They're not saying don't do it in my backyard, but don't do it in somebody else's. They're saying don't do it in anybody's backyard. The Green Group, the opponents of shale gas are often derided as being NIMBYs and green extremists. But the people who are opposing shale gas extraction and fracking include the National Trust, the governments of France and Bulgaria, the US state of Vermont. The environment ministers of all the Länder in Germany have said that they don't think there's enough information to carry on with fracking. The European Commission has been raising concerns about the local environmental impacts. The United Nations Environment Programme has said that fracking cannot go, if you go ahead with fracking, you cannot guarantee, even if you do it properly, that there will not be unavoidable environmental concerns. The government puts forward shale gas as being a solution to the biggest problem which a lot of people face, which is about energy bills. David Cameron persists in saying that shale gas extraction will cut energy bills. He's saying it today. The trouble is, his own Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change said UK shale gas will not cut energy bills. Lord Stern, the eminent climate change economist, has said that David Cameron's claim that shale gas will cut energy bills is, quote, faceless economics, unquote. Even Quadrilla say that the impact of shale gas on prices will be basically insignificant. It's not the answer to rising energy bills. It's not the answer to tackling the blackouts, because even if the industry got the go-ahead today to go ahead as fast as it wanted to, we wouldn't see significant production for another decade. It's not going to help us keep the lights on in 2 or 3 years' time. Shale gas is not the answer. It's unnecessary, it's unwanted, and it's unconventional. We've got the solutions. It's cutting energy waste, it's investing in renewables. Shale gas is a risk that we in the UK simply do not need to take. If we're saying that fracking and unconventional gas is the answer, then we're asking the wrong questions. Thank you.
Well, I think we've heard a few different opinions there to get us going. I think there were a couple of direct points going back and forth there on what each other person said. So maybe if would the speakers like to respond to anything that's been said?
Yeah, one of the things Tony said, was about the EIA, where it ends, where that ends. So it's not a perfect thing, like all legislation, it's got a start and an end. But where it actually ends, there's also other legislation that takes over, and that's called the Sea Directive. So although you've got lots of restrictions in EIA, it doesn't mean that once they're exceeded, that's it, we're doomed. There is other things that take over.
James?
Well, I just thought, just to deal with Erik's point a little bit, thank you, Simon. We need some serious IT help here, but there we go. Methane emissions are a bit of a problem, you know, and I hope the other speakers have understood that, you know, I'm not saying that fracking is perfect in every degree, must be applied on the premises here and in every situation and all of these things. What I'm saying is that, hooray, today's fracking is different from the napalm that we were using in 1947. That's what innovation is about. That's what progress is about. That's what higher productivity is about. Now, in fact, one of the most authoritative critiques of fracking has just been published by the American science organization, PNAS, and you can see it's strictly on Erik's point. It revealed that the emissions from natural gas in general in the United States and fracking are larger than we thought. But what nobody recognized, if I can just find it for you, is a little thing which I've highlighted here. There. Let me see if I can make it bigger. There we go. Which is exactly the point I'm trying to make, which is that emissions were estimated in the United States at 2545 gigograms in 2011, compared with 2948 gigograms in 2009 and 2724 in 2010. In other words, the emissions have been going down from both conventional gas extraction in the United States and fracking. And that's because people have paid more attention to the pumps, to the compressors, to the pipelines, they've been measuring it better, and so on. So I can agree with Erik that methane is a dangerous gas, that it increases climate change, and so on. And I can also agree with Tony that fracking is a number of years off. But what I'm saying is, if you believe in innovation, if you believe in human ingenuity, then the years that fracking still has to wait for will compress, and the amount of methane emitted can be got under control. I don't perhaps have all of Joanne's faith in the regulators. I don't like the fat controller in Whitehall very much. Although I think we all agree that we need some regulation, and that with careful attention we can make sure that fracking is safe in most places. Not in every place, but in most places. Now, the most substantive argument, I think, I may come back on it, is the one that I think was raised on by Erik, or maybe it was Tony, and that is, you know, in terms of the sea levels. I think it was Erik, in fact. Now, this kind of alarmism, although some would like to see the destruction of Westminster, you know, I don't think helps us very much. It's of a piece with those who say, well, look, you know, the last time we were, you know, this hot is back in the Ice Age. There's one difference between us and the Ice Age, and it's the same difference between us and 1947 America, which is we know a bit more than mammoths or 40s Americans. We are more knowledgeable, we are more scientific, we have developed innovation, and therefore we have the capacity to adapt to rising sea levels, to build new kinds of defences in Africa and India, while people are already dying because of lack of energy, and the 300 million people in India who suffered power cuts only last year. So before we rush to say, look, we cannot handle higher sea levels, I believe that we can, because, you know, we have shown that we are capable of some very serious breakthroughs in engineering. And it's that loss of faith in engineering and that dependency not on oil or gas, as if we were addicted to the addiction metaphor, which everybody loves so much, but it's actually the, not dependency, but the fear that surrounds innovation that I try to deal with. And I'd like the other critics of fracking to say, well, look, what kind of innovations, if any, you know, do they support? I've got plenty more to say on fracking, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. All right, briefly, I'll let that last one go. I'd love to just go to the South Pacific and talk to the islanders there about up to their knees.
If you're giving me the ticket,
I would love to see you argue there. Sandy flooded Lower Manhattan severely just a while back. There is no way we can geoengineer our way out of this. No way. There isn't enough money that we can ever produce. That is just false hope. I would like to just be clear, maybe a link Joanne's EIA point. I was actually an EIA coordinator for the whole first half of my career, so yeah, I do know a bit about environmental impact assessment. And what I learned in that time, and it goes back to what Joanne's saying about methane emissions, is that very often EIAs and the projections on future emissions and routine emissions from the industry are based on when everything's working fine. Because unplanned events are, by definition, very hard to predict what's going to happen, how often, how severe, what's going to. It's the same argument for carbon sequestration and carbon capture. It's great if it works. If it goes wrong, it's not going to go well for us. And so it really is not sensible just to go on existing figures. A lot of what's happening in the industry, and a lot of what EIA prediction is based upon, is what operators say is going to happen, not what the worst case scenario is. And the worst case scenario for us is pretty damn bad.
Yes, just a couple of brief comments. I agree with James that innovation in energy is needed. James seems to think, however, you can only have innovation looking down one track, which is about fossil fuels. Yes, we do need innovation. Let's put that innovation into things which are not going to make the problem worse. Let's put that innovation into cutting the cost of renewable energy. Let's put that innovation into marine and tidal energy. Let's put that innovation into the solutions, not into making the problems worse. And I found his comment that we should be trying to make it fracking, as safe as we can, make fracking safe in most places. I found that scary, to be honest. If you're in one of the areas where fracking isn't safe, what's the outlook for you? I've got a report in front of me, I was reading it today, from the German Advisory Council on the Environment. This is a body which advises the German government. It came out a few months ago, it's only just been published in English. They said, fracking can contaminate the groundwater via subterranean paths. Such contamination is largely irreversible. Is that the sort of thing that we're prepared to say if we want fracking to be safe in most areas, that we'll accept irreversible contamination of groundwater?
Right, now it's your chance. I'm sure people in the audience have got very strong opinions on this and would like to say their points, either backing up or contradicting the speakers. But I was just wondering, first of all, has there anyone got any questions directly to the speakers on what they've said and you're not sure about what they've said? If you could maybe show your hands to give me a chance. Got somebody who's going to take a microphone around? There you go. So if you go to this man here first.
I was just wondering exactly how you mentioned figures on methane for fracking compared to conventional gas and oil. Where exactly does it stand compared to conventional gas and oil with regards to methane problem? Because I wasn't sure about that.
Okay, I'll come, if you can make a note of that. There was another one, I see. Oh, you run a bit. Somebody right at the back.
I was interested in James's point about notes. He said we should maybe be doing some careful experimenting. I'd like you to express how that could go on, and is present political climate of a global race rhetoric conducive to such an experiment in Britain?
Okay, I'll come to you in a second with that. Any more questions? There's the cameraman.
Both Erik and Tony mentioned that they'd spoken to the protesters, and I just wondered, from speaking to the protesters, what was your impression of their main concerns, and do you think these were rational concerns? Because I interviewed the protesters in Balcombe, and I perhaps got a different impression.
Was that your video that was shown online?
I have got video online, yeah. It's at danclayton.co.uk.
There's one here in the middle. taxes.
Hello, Joanne reeled off the list of rules and regulations, but I wasn't really clear what point you were trying to make. Were you trying to say we have so many regulations, it'll be all right? There'll be lots of authorities looking out for us, or what? I was not at all clear about your message.
Okay, I'll take one more question, and then I'll come back to the speakers. This man here.
Question for Erik. You mentioned the 4% increase in global sea temperature. Is that to what extent is that using the amount of shale available? Is that 100%? Is it some of it? Is it just a point of clarification?
What are you, Tony? You will work away this way.
Question about what were the main concerns of the protesters. The main concerns of the people at local level who I've spoken to, understandably, they're starting out being concerned about the impact on their local environment and their health. They're concerned about what this could mean. They've heard stories about earthquakes, and it's not just the impact of earthquakes at surface level. We've got to be worried about, the Environment Agency has said they are worried about what the impact of earthquakes could be on the shale gas well itself. They're worried about if you have an earthquake and it buckles the well, that increases the risk of methane leaking or the toxic fluid which they're using to frack the well leaking. Local people are concerned about that. They're concerned about the potential of water contamination. They're concerned about air pollution. They're concerned about the amount of traffic and the noise, which have been huge problems in Balkan. But what we noticed fairly quickly is that local people also realise that this is a global environmental problem. They realise that this is not just about their local environment. They recognise that this is about the energy policy of the UK and also about climate change.
Okay, if you directed me, I'll knock through very, very quickly. You were asking about the methane compared to other forms of hydrocarbon exploitation. A few more quick statistics. 40% of greenhouse gases associated emissions associated with gas, and about 40 to 60% of that is from shale gas. About 7% of every well is lost because they leak. There's expected to be about 1 million wells in the US and 1 million more in China if the IEA predictions are right, never mind the rest of the world. So you can see how that's going to happen. Sea level rise, yeah, not quite clear, so let's just say that I made those points to try to explain what the world is going to be like if we get between 2 and 3 degrees of warming, of which the emission of both carbon dioxide through burning of fossil fuels and the fugitive emissions of methane will contribute. Okay, so it's not a direct line, but it's part of the story. Sorry for that confusion. And then finally, great question about protesters. So I went over to talk to the Marcellus protests. I just asked for an interview. It went quiet because the industry are really hammering them. They're setting them up as criminals. They're getting them watched. There's some of them think that their phones are tapped, but they can't corroborate that. But what I did find was that it was a whole range of different people: older people, younger people, professionals, Republicans, Democrats. It was really, really interesting. It was a complete mix. They weren't a unified force. They were often in smaller organising groups and came together as Marcellus protests when numbers were required. So if they wanted to, have a demonstration or something like that, they were worried not just about the environmental issues. They were worried about political corruption. They were worried about corporate greed. Many of them got involved because the frackers were buying up land to inflate their stock price, because once you buy land, you can crack on that you've got resource underneath it, whether it was exploitable or not. And they made the grievous mistake of approaching the churches, who were only too pleased to make money out of them for access to license. And then, of course, the journos got hold of it and said, frackers going into grave sites. That alarmed everybody. And it culminated in the entire city of Pittsburgh banning fracking, which now the state, which is pro-fracking, is challenging. So, I mean, it's an amazing story of determination. I found them incredibly rational, lucid, and for the most part, ordinary people who were coming together for a range of different reasons.
And would I be right in thinking it's covered in more detail
Oh,
in this book here? Which I'm sure Erik will be able to give you more detail.
Thank you very much.
I've got two things really that I'd like to say. One is answering the lady's question. The regulation, there is a lot of legislation and regulation around fracking, but it actually provides a very strong framework, and that framework is actually needed really. So I don't think there's too much, although there is a lot of legislation. But ultimately, the actual onus for the monitoring of it is actually on the fracking organisations. So if they do, for want of a word, stuff up, then they're going to be annihilated. But it's actually the concentrations of the actual products that they're using and not the actual products that's causing the issue and the regulation. So there's polyacrylamides. So they're actually the friction reducers that will enable the flowback waters to come out. That's actually used in cosmetics and facial creams. So it's the concentration and not the actual product. There's, the other ones, the biocides, they're used for purification of the water if the water's not actually clean enough to go into the ground in the first place. So, we do need the legislation, but ultimately it's the organisation that needs to monitor, because that's what we do in this country, we self-monitor. I also want to kind of disagree with Erik, that's the second thing I want to say. So if you disagree so much with the EIA forecasts and everything, yet your entire argument is based upon forecasts. So you either agree with forecasts or you disagree with forecasts, really. You can't kind of do both.
It's measurements, not forecasts, but,
Joanne?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to take up 2 points, if I may. No, I've got a mic now, I guess. So all right. Forgive this, but I like to anticipate the critics. So I like to anticipate Scientific American, as I said. So let's get this up here. Where are we now? Yeah, here we go. If we look at the speaker at the back asked, what did I mean by an experiment? Well, the big experiment that's already been happening is in America. And if you believe Earth Justice, she had a lovely strapline for Americans, because the Earth needs a good liar. Because as we know, being a liar is the main growth industry in the States for the last 100 years. If you look at their map, the results of that big experiment in the States would seem to indicate a whole bundle of skull and crossbones everywhere you go, and in lots of places. If you actually click on the skull and crossbones, what you'll find is that most of the accidents they're talking about happen to cow and other things. There's 1 or 2 deaths, and I've taken the liberty of exploding one of those deaths, which has happened in DeSoto Parish in Louisiana, where a person died. Well, that's one person too many in my book. But when you think about 45 people dying from murders every day in the United States, or 89 every day through car accidents, I think it does get it in some perspective. So, science and technology, innovation, investment, in energy as elsewhere, is dangerous. People will die. But really what's at issue here is the precautionary principle, which is, what the EU, which Tony so much loves, favours, is, don't do anything unless you've shown it to be completely safe. Well, if I come to Erik's native Australia, if I have you right, Erik, no? Well, Vanuatu, somewhere the other side of the world, I say, I've got a brand new innovation, it's a bit dangerous at times, can kill people, including women and children, what about giving it a whirl? The EU would say no, but if I tell you the innovation is fire, kills quite a lot of people in Australia from time to time, I think you'd agree with me that we've generally developed the fire engine, the fire hose, the fire blanket, the fire extinguisher, the fire alarm, and so therefore, though that new technology does create problems, on the whole, we tend to get around those problems with more new technology. That's my perspective. There are some problems, I'll try to indicate them. I can just add to that. I think the other charge Tony made, I'm sorry, I'll give you my slideshow later, but to say that I just want innovation in fossil fuels, presumably I'm a fossil fuel addict and all the rest of it, but I'm in favour of carbon capture and storage to deal with the carbon dimension of fossil fuels. I'm very pleased that Scotland is pioneering it not for coal, but for gas as well. I'm also in favour of sucking Britain's Victorian emissions out of the atmosphere and turning them into fuels, as they're trying to do in Sandia, New Mexico, and they heat up rust with solar power, and then they use that to strip CO2 of the oxygen, hang on to the carbon, and then combine it with hydrogen from water to make fuel. Here's one of them looking remarkably like Roy Orbison, doing exactly that. And here, published in the Daily Mirror, if you please, is, you know, a way not just of stopping new carbon emissions, but actually reducing the old stocks of carbon that Britain built up in the 19th century. I'm in favour of small modular reactors with the little tweaky Lego trucks at the top that are sealed and you know, probably much safer than nuclear reactors, which, with the exception of Chernobyl, which was done under Stalinism, have killed not nearly so many people as coal mining, fracking, or all the other things. If you look at the deaths in Fukushima, there are none. Of course, when I'm being cautious about it, I think it was very foolish to put Fukushima in the middle of a seismic site. That is a problem. I didn't know that earthquakes in Britain could so much destroy a fracking expedition, but if I can be given the evidence, I'm ready to be persuaded. But what I'm not persuaded of is that we should confine our efforts to renewables and you know, saving energy. Let me say, there's a lot to do in pipelines. If you look at the Aussies, they're very good at pipelines, but if you look at how primitive they are, most pipes, with this kind of technology, there's a lot to do there. So it's not just the wells we need to be careful about, it's the whole infrastructure.
Now, I believe there's probably a few people in the audience with opinions on this. So I'd like to hear a few of them. So if you'd like to indicate, yes, the lady here.
Yeah, I don't really need this. What frightens me is the methane. I mean, I watched a programme from America where a guy turned his tap on and set fire to the methane in the water. How frightening is that?
Okay. Any more?
No, don't give me that.
You might think that, but actually the people behind you.
Okay. Okay, I don't really know where to start. If I work from left to right, innovation argument, brilliant, entirely support. We should always invest in more innovation. My slight concern is you don't invest in innovation with fracking, you invest in dependency on fracking. And what that then does is it removes investment in innovation in other areas. What won't happen over the next 20, 30 years is you won't see any investment in renewables because we will become entirely dependent on fracking. That's what actually will happen. So move on to Joanne. Sorry, I'm going to talk for a while now. I'm giving you the microphone.
Turn the microphone on.
Yeah, EIAs are great. Regulation is fantastic. I entirely agree with the new thing, with everything to do with them. However, Erik and Tony made some very good points about when you actually apply the regulation about size, and that wasn't answered about the square hectare. Not to mention things like UK CIP. I did some work on that. Climate projections, you use them, fantastic. The problem is you have a sliding scale with UK CIP. This is a climate projection model for anyone who's curious, and they will tell you the most likely, then a 90%, and then a 10%. i.e. it might raise by 1.3%, it could be as bad as 2.8, it could be as worse as 0.8 degrees increase, right? Guess where on the scale they tend to take it from, below or middle. They never do the worst case scenario with the IAs, they always take the middle road. That's just a projection argument for you. Thank God, Tony, you talked about tidal. That was one line I'm very, very happy to hear because there is no investment in that renewable at the moment. And it is the entirely most dependent point that UK have. We have one of the most strongest tidal and regular tidal patterns across the entire world. The fact that we don't invest in that is a crime. And on one final point, we've talked a lot about earthquakes, we've heard a lot about like sea level rise and other environmental disasters that happen. That's not the only issue with climate change. you've got something called biome shifts, which is basically where you see a change in the ecosystem across the entire equatorial zone state. They are slightly smaller deserts, they become bigger deserts. So the UK is fantastic. We go from temperate to tropic. We get nicer summers, less winters. You know, these are good things. But with countries that have an agricultural dependency and are used to functioning in a certain climate, you change that, you disrupt that, they can't function anymore. That's an economic disaster, that's an immigration disaster, that's not just environmental, it is a sustainable disaster.
Okay, any more?
I should probably make a few points.
I'll let the man at the front come in, and then you afterwards.
Thank you.
So, the one next to you, and then I'll walk there and then back to you.
It's kind of a question to you, Erik, about the issue of authority that you raised, that there is a really serious problem of authority and the authority of knowledge in society. And you kind of make a quip that I found really troubling about the fracking industry and the impacts that it might have on some graves. For me, that's kind of scaremongering and not a serious discussion. And once you start to lose the credibility and the authority of sources of information, and particularly when you play on it, that's a profoundly serious problem for democracy, because you've got very few mechanisms to work out where the real balance is. And for me, that's the thing that I find quite irritating about the fracking demonstrators. And I'm a big fan of direct action and getting stuff done, and don't worry too much about the rules and all that type of stuff. But there becomes a point at which then potentially demonstrators give up on winning the argument and give up on having the discussion out in public and just either play on fears or just decide, well, nobody knows anything anyway, we'll just decide for everyone else. And that's seriously problematic. So can you kind of come back on what you're doing with that issue of authority there?
Thank you very much. I should probably point out that my day job is securing groundwater supplies. So I spend a great deal of time looking at the risks that are presented to groundwater supplies by fracking and a whole pile of other interventions. Amongst other things, I sit on the UK Water Industries Group, looking at the impacts of fracking on water supplies. So we'll start by addressing the point that you made there. I think it was about a gas landfill showing methane extraction from a tap. Yes, that would be very, very worrying. That doesn't currently worry me with the current UK fracking procedures. A number of reasons for that. The US regulatory environment is not the same as the EIA system that we have in the UK. That's a problem for people in the US. A lot of them draw water from local suppliers, from local wells and local boreholes that do interface with the shale layers that are being extracted from fracking. So there is a clear progressive path that allows methane to escape from these beds and find their way into people's water supplies. That's not a worry that I hope we have in the UK. There are some areas that suffer more from it than the Northwest. We spoke about Balcombe a couple of times during the debate. That is an area that does suffer from some pretty serious water restrictions. There are a lot of people living along the south coast of England, and their rain shadow, if you like, is very large. It's difficult for them to get reliable supplies of water to those conurbations. That puts an extra special stress when it comes to making sure that wells are correctly looked after. One of the speakers did point out that there was an irreversible route. Once a fracking borehole has found its way into an aquifer, there is a chance of permanent damage. That is true. There is a chance of permanent damage. One of the things that I work with most days is trying to prevent that there isn't a route between those two, that we actually don't have an opportunity of interfaces between shale fracking layers and water aquifer layers. And one of the things that I've been doing in the last couple of weeks is actually making sure that there's no sign of any of the surfactants or propellants or other chemicals that were, again, mentioned by the speakers in our existing water supplies, and making sure that the water companies have a day-in, day-out requirement to check those, and a useful route to push back on government to make sure that the government responds should damage actually occur. I must admit, from an Institute of Engineering and Technology point of view, I might be interested in a talk from this man who seems to know a lot about the subject. I said go to you, man at the front. You can apologise. You're going to earn your money running back and forth, and then I'll come to you afterwards.
A slight defence of the wider energy industry, and that fracking isn't to come back to the point that the second gentleman made. Fracking doesn't mean there's not going to be any more investment anywhere across the energy sector. I work for a wind farm developer, and we're constantly innovating. We're building taller turbines. We're putting places in different areas. Awful lot of investment going into tidal, wave around Scotland, and across the wider country. Just because this thing is new and different, that it's getting an awful lot of stick, and I take an awful lot of your points on board with that. It just feels like onshore wind was five or 6 years ago and still is. Fracking becomes the general whipping boy of the energy industry, and then it gets beaten down. And from my point of view, it's great because it's taking the flak off onshore wind for a while. But I don't think it's right to kill an idea before you've fully explored it.
Sorry, I'm making you run around. If you have a point yourself to make in a minute, I'll let you in.
Well, I would just like to say that I totally concur with James, and this probably is not very relevant, but in my lifetime, I believe that we had drinking water that came through pipes that were made of lead. And I wonder how many, what sort of statistic there was with people who died, and indeed some people still have old buildings, do they not, that are made of lead.
We don't for that.
But that got sorted, didn't it? Somebody found out about it, and it got sorted. Maybe not totally, maybe we should be looking at that anyway. Should we not?
I think there was somebody behind you. Yes.
Yes, I'd make 2 points really. One point is it's very difficult to know who to believe because there's so many people on either side straightforward facts. We see the photographs of London supposedly in the flood. I was at the London tidal barrier early this week. It closed the barrier twice a month at the moment. Twice a month. The worst predictions is they'll close it 4 times a month for a tide. That's 6 hours at the most. So that would appear as though the London scenario of flooding is totally unrealistic. That doesn't do anybody any good, putting those sort of facts and figures up, or those photographs. The second thing is the meteorologists are having to rethink what increasing climate change, because I'm not a denier, is actually going to do to our weather. They don't really know. That's just go and look at the meteorologist sites. And my last point is, and it's a question that I don't know which learned speaker can answer, but where is the comparison about getting oil from the Middle East, the costs of getting it to this country, the amount of emissions per oil burning in this country compared to methane gas burning, and also look at the corollary effects of what's happening in the States. Because they've got more of their own power, they are now clawing back production from China. What about the emission costs of all that production they're clawing back from China? Where is the balance? Where is the true cost? Not the controversial stuff that we hear so much of. Thank you.
I'm just wondering, are there any more? If anyone who wants to speak before I bring these people here back in for a second, you can put your hand up now, and then I'll try and get you in, and then I'll go to the back. So, the lady down here, and then I'll come to those two there.
We don't seem to have discussed energy security very much in this discussion. And I understand that requirements for energy are set to increase by about 50% over the next 20 years. And that if we look at our current energy supply situation, we get liquefied natural gas from Qatar by tanker which goes into Milford Haven. We don't own that gas until it's docked at Milford Haven. And we've had no gas from them for the since last October, since we have been outbid by Argentina, by Korea and by Japan. So this is obviously going to increase as energy demands increase. So my question for Friends of the Earth is, what percentage of our current energy demands are currently met by renewables? I've heard the figure 11% for 2012 used. And if that's the case, how long would it be before renewables could make a substantial contribution to our energy requirements? And my second question was in regard to research and development. There are leaks from fracking operations, and currently they either let them just go up into the atmosphere, which is not very good, obviously, since methane's a bad greenhouse gas. Either let them go up or flare them, which means they're releasing carbon dioxide. So I was recently speaking to a fracking company and saying, well, obviously this is not sustainable. And they said, well, look, if you can alert us to anywhere on the planet that fracking companies have developed a way of not using either of those solutions, we promise we will take that up. So I just wondered whether that's in fact happening, to your knowledge, anywhere on the planet.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 more points and then come back to the panel. But you'll get another chance to make. There was a man in the audience. Yes, you there. And then the cameraman.
So I've noticed, as in common a lot of debates these days, the issue is very polarised. And just an observation, it seems to me like the debate on fracking is less a debate on the technology and processes and things to do with the shale gas and coal and methane and all these processes than it is about climate change. And so it's, I'd like to say, it's less of an issue on the fracking than it is the climate change, I've noticed, is what most people seem to be campaigning for. And a lot of the issues like water quality, air pollution things are in many respects engineering problems rather than problems in principle with the process itself.
When I interviewed the protesters at Balkan, I was expecting climate change to be one of their main concerns, and I was actually surprised they didn't actually mention climate change. They were more concerned about the water contamination. But what struck me about the Balkan protesters is that none of them were local, and they all expressed a deep distrust of government and business. And I'm wondering what's the correlation between the fears that they express and their distrust of government and business. 2 quick questions. Why the either or when it comes to innovation? We're still going to use gas. Everybody's main bills are electricity and gas. People aren't just going to turn off their gas taps. Why not innovate in cheaper gas source? Second question to Erik. Why the pessimism about engineering when it comes to floods, for example? I mean, there was a good documentary showing the contrast between Lagos and I think it was Tokyo in Japan, where with this infrastructure investment in Tokyo, flooding is not an issue. Why the pessimism when it comes to engineering? Surely there is scope to deal with flooding.
Right, I'm just going to bring back the panel who will hopefully just make 1 point in response this time, and then I'll make a more substantial point in the end, and then I'll go back out to the audience.
This is to the young man over there. I totally agree with you with the weather forecasting inaccuracies, because they're too wide, absolutely too wide. So is that research and development? I don't know, it is too wide. But when you're doing an EIA, it's not just the weather on whether it's going to be a flood site or a drought site. You've also got to look at how many people are going to be living there. So they've got to have their water before you can use it for industry, really. But you've also got the noise, aesthetics and biodiversity, travelling. There's loads of different things, about 13 different things. So it's just one little bit really with the weather.
You ready, James?
I think so, yeah. Well, I'll stick to one point, which is, I agree with our Australian friend. I don't know how well Australia is endowed with tidal. I'm a big fan of tidal, and I think that it's terrific that we have such a tidal resource in this country. I'm not so convinced on wave, by the way. I think the physics doesn't help us on wave. But if you look at the Salon barrage, it's 8 gigawatts. Friends of the Earth is opposed to it. So that's a problem for us, because once you get the fear mentality, then you're going to be opposed to anything on a large scale. I know that birds are more important than human beings. Don't misunderstand me here. But I've heard some ornithologists say that actually the Salon barrage will be better for birds. So, let the birds and the bees carry on, that's what I say. Let me just add that I'm all in favour of innovation in renewable energy in general. If you look at nature, with this wonderful material I didn't know about, sounds Russian, perovskite. If you make that in layers rather than make it in a complex three-dimensional array as they've been doing the last few years, apparently you get a 4-fold increase in solar power. Terrific news. Let's have some more of that. And let's have it across all energy sources, because it isn't about the competition between source A versus source B. It's about productivity, innovation across all the sources. The one thing I agree with Al Gore about is that there's no silver bullet. Right? We need innovation across all the sources. Let me say I do agree with Tony on one thing, which is I never made the claim, I think it would be foolish to make the claim, that fracking will lower energy prices and will destroy fuel poverty. I'd like to believe it. Tendentially, one could believe it. But by the time it's been through the city, the big six, and everybody else, Middle East, you name it, God, if you can understand your EDF bill, you're a better man than this physicist, right? And the same applies to prices. So that's not a claim I would make for fracking. What I'm claiming is that every form of energy must be mobilised to solve the energy gap. And if it takes a long time to do fracking, I'm sad, let's do it quicker. Do the experiments, solve the safety problems, we'll be all right.
Okay, I will go for one, but I'll try to rope in a few more. A lot of people make some very good points. So I'm going to mainly address the very good question that the man over here said about authority. And just clear up one thing I said, did not mean to be flippant at all about grave sets. I mentioned it because I was talking about the different ways that people got involved in the debate, and one was the way that journalists highlighted the fact that gas companies were buying up as much land as they could, including church-owned land. So, of course, it was feasible, possible to frack grave sites, but obviously they never would. But because of the hoo-ha that was created, it got people interested. That was the only point. So, well, it was certainly not meant to be a sensationalist comment. But you make a really good point or a question to me about authority. Most of the people I've talked to, not only fracking, but also people who are concerned about food, about wider energy issues, about transport debates. A lot of people who are active at the moment are saying that, from the Kyoto Agreement to national agreements to the way that the political cycles are so short-term, the way the economic cycles are even shorter, it is very hard to see, or for them to see at least, how people in authority can keep their constituencies, pay their shareholders, and solve these global problems, which affect all of us, but they are not in a position to answer if they want to hold on to what they've got. And that's the fundamental problem. And so I know it's scary and it's unfortunate, and you really, really wish those who represent us would make the right decisions for ourselves and for future generations. Most people are active in this area, coming to the realization that just isn't going to happen. They're starting to organize themselves to protect the people that they care about, the vulnerable in their communities. And I think that's actually quite heartening, because it lifts the lid on people who are feeling frustrated and worried and scared but feel they can't do anything about it. At least people are feeling empowered. It's good for your mental health, if not for the survival of the species. And so it is important to remember on things like for energy security and for flooding and a few of the other issues that that Jared Diamond's retelling of the Easter Island story is really a really good example. That when we tie ourselves in to economic, cultural and social ruts in the road that we think we can't get out of. Oh, the light's going out, so we must cleave on to this thing that's right next to us, even though it'll probably kill us and a little there, but at least we won't die earlier than that. We have to break away from that. We have to take a step back and not do what the Easter Islanders did, which was to cut down trees to the oblivion, because they were just caught up in this socio-economic, political rut that they couldn't break out of. We have to take the power ourselves.
I'm going to answer a couple of questions, hopefully quite briefly. The question the gentleman asked about water and water contamination. There are communities in the UK who are still using boreholes. Erik, the MP for Lancaster, has said that a lot of the communities in his area are still using boreholes. One of the reasons why he's concerned.
22% of the supply to his constituency comes from boreholes.
There we are. I think what we can't, one of the problems that we can't, that the fracking industry cannot say is there is not going to be a long-term problem. There might not have been problems so far, but the sort of high-volume, high-pressure hydraulic fracking that they've been doing over the last decade, it's only been going for 10 years. We're not into the long-term yet. They cannot say there is not going to be a long-term problem. The water framework, the EU Water Framework Directive, says we should be adopting a precautionary principle and avoiding where there is a risk of contamination of groundwater supplies, we should be avoiding it. Surely that should be applying in the case of fracking, particularly given the figures which Schlumberger, an oil drilling company, has put out in their oil field review. They say that 6% of wells or gas wells fail immediately. 50% of them fail within 20 years. That's a concern in the long run. The other point I wanted to make, just a quick comment about...
How do you equate, you said failure, but failure in what sense?
Okay, you can carry on.
Yeah. Gentleman at the back of the cameraman was talking about, we're talking about the bulk of protesters not being local. There were people from outside the area, but the locals were there at the heart of the protests, and they were welcoming in the people from outside. And the protesters are not giving up the argument. They are not giving up on public debate. What they're doing, their actions are creating the space for public debate. It is their actions which have made fracking into a public and political issue, the issue that it is today. Then a very quick comment about answering the latest question about renewables and energy security. Gas is not, fracking and shale gas is not the answer to our energy security problems. There's no guarantee that gas that we drill here is going to be used in the UK. At the EU level, the most optimistic case for shale gas at EU level is it will keep us 60% dependent on imported gas. And the fact that we're going to be, if we build a whole load of gas-fired power stations like the government wants to in a second dash of gas, on the basis that we've got some shale gas, we don't know how much, we've no idea how much it's going to cost us, then we're going to get ourselves locked into gas, dependency on gas for power generation, and we can't supply all that gas ourselves, so we're going to continue to be import dependent. So Friends of the Earth see that the answer is let's go for a big programme of cutting energy waste, and let's promote renewables. And we put out a report called the Plan for Clean British Energy, which shows how we think you can get to providing 2/3 of the UK's need for electricity generation from renewables by 2030.
Right, I think we're going to be finished by 8:30.
Yeah.
So we've got about just over 10 minutes of discussion, and then I'll bring the panel back. Did you want to make your point?
Yes, I did, because the last speaker actually said failure of the wells. He did not specify in what sense. He did not say failure, contamination of water supply. Where's the facts and figures on that? He hasn't got them.
Okay, we can come back at the end. I'll let the man with the microphone and then at the front here.
you mentioned, talking in your introduction about cutting back on energy use. Would you ever envisage a time when we'd have more and more energy, so that we might not have this, I think you said, southeastern rain shadow where people are struggling with water? We could actually desalinate, can't even say the word anymore. We could
use the seawater.
Audience participation, that's one. Yeah, with more energy we could do a lot of things. We might even get jetpacks one day.
Can you come down the front here for this?
I think that James, in painting a picture of a fairly glorious future, depending upon research and development, has in fact been rather naughty and guilty of quite a few sins of omission. To begin with, mentioning Maria van der Hoeven, who is the deputy in the International Energy Agency. Not only her, but her boss, Mr. Fatih Birol, when they wrote their last energy review, not only talked about how much energy we can use, but above all, how much we shouldn't use. Their voice was almost identical to that of Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace. They said we've got to get out of carbon quickly, straight away, or we're heading for disaster. Disaster is their word, not ours, not the words of traditional campaigners. Next, when he was talking about rising sea levels, if they don't matter, surely James, as a professor, if I may say so, knows that one of the most important habitats of the whole world are coastal habitats, involving estuaries as well. If there is a rise in sea level, there is a certainty of extreme salt extrusion into areas which at the moment depend upon fresh water for growing rice, for fresh water for drinking, etc. There's a ruination of 7 million square kilometres of agricultural land, which is going to result if we get 2 or 3 metres of sea level rise. Thirdly, he mentions carbon capture and storage, CCS, several omissions there. The first one is that he neglected to tell us that most EOR, enhanced oil recovery, using carbon dioxide is used to extract more oil. And that oil itself goes into motor vehicles from which the carbon dioxide cannot be extracted because it's millions of point sources. He should have said this. On top of that, he should have said that the world's foremost factory and research centre for looking into carbon capture and storage in Norway, Mongstad, has suddenly closed completely because of the Conservative government that's come there. Am I allowed to mention further omissions?
One more point.
One more, okay. There's a lot more, but I'll mention just one. What he has not mentioned, because he's again a professor and a man of figures and mathematics, but the basic question is one of the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. For the last 10,000 years, what has kept our climate stable has been an almost invariable level of 280 parts per million. It is now 400. It is essential that 400 comes down to 280, and that's where research and development should go.
Okay, can you take the microphone over to her? You can applaud people from the floor.
I just want to explore further the issue of water pollution because, sticking to the sort of current knowledge rather than what might happen in decades to come, I've understood that we are talking about millions of cubic metres of water filled with toxic products that are being pumped into the ground, very, very deep into the ground. And even though some of it can be retrieved, a lot of it will stay in the ground. And I'm really worried about that from a very practical, this decade perspective. And I think anybody that lives near a fracking site has every reason and right to be concerned about that. My question is not to do with climate change or what happens in the long term, but about the here and now. And I don't feel we've had nearly enough factual information about how we cope with that. And the second part of my question is really, I've also understood that this process of pumping water into the ground and then retrieving it and the whole operation itself consumes a huge amount of energy. So I'm really unclear about what the new energy benefits are of the whole fracking enterprise, as well as the costs of clear-up. Thirdly, the UK is a tiny country compared to the States. And when you look at the devastation that that's caused to hundreds of acres of land, I'm really worried about the effect of mass fracking in the UK, in our small island. I'd like some answers to those practical questions.
Okay, can I see any more hands of people who want to make a point before I close? Oh, it looks as though everyone's happy. And if you want to make a point about water pollution?
Well, I was just about to say I could answer some of those points. Actually, I'm sure the directors of Quadrilla are absolutely fascinated with knowing what the net energy cost would be to extract it from the system and to deal with the pollutants that come from that. A couple of things worth noting. Fracking fluids, as they are allowed to use under European regulations, are difficult to describe as toxic without kind of sounding a bit scaremongery. Two main chemicals are included in fracking fluids. One of those are inert silicates. They act as propellants. They actually hold the cracks open. The other ones are types of surfactants. So they are like soaps or lubricants occasionally as well. The European Court and the European regulatory structure is worried about those. It has actually clamped down on UK fracking companies from using some of the compounds that the US fracking system uses. Another point is in the US, environmental regulations about the produced waters are at best described as lax. European regulations simply don't allow for the disposal of solids that are created in the produced waters to go onto the roads and into the local environment as they are in the US. But that also has a consequence. There's a lot of energy required to treat that produced water to the required standard that the environment could accept. And that's something that needs to go into the calculation.
Are there anyone who want to make any last points? Yes, the lady here.
I just wanted to ask, what do you think fracking would play in a role in the fuel prices that we might have if we try to move away from fossil fuels? Then we'll have nothing to power cars. And in general, don't you think we should sort of like look at what we already have and try to innovate that rather than looking into new technologies and then trying to solve the problem when that goes wrong, rather than just making the current ones better?
And there's somebody behind you there.
Just a slight note about water contamination as well. So many millions of gallons of water are forced down the wellbore during the initial fracking process with the chemicals in, and it mixes with what's underground very deep. In the UK, it's very, very deep. In the US, it's a lot shallower, hence a lot more risk of contamination. And it mixes with naturally occurring radioactive minerals and saline salts, which tend to occur at these depths. It's not drinking water down at 2 or 3 kilometres, and it all comes back up over a period of several weeks. And that all comes back up and is treated. You're not allowed to dump it under European and UK law. Another thing is just perhaps slightly off topic, but to do with conventional versus unconventional. When you have a normal oil and gas well, they force water down to recover more oil and gas, and so what comes up the wellbore is a mixture of mostly water. 90% is a cut-off when they stop producing oil and gas, when they cut the well off. And so the water usage in fracking is initially high, and then once you finish the process after a few weeks, it's mainly dry gas that comes up. And with a conventional oil and gas well, you're actually using a lot of water, but over a long, long time period. So that's something to consider with water usage, conventional versus unconventional.
Yeah, I mean, there is one other figure on water usage, just to give you some context. An average fracking well is something like possibly 250 megalitres. That would be the amount of water that Manchester consumes in 4 hours, but that fracking well would use it over possibly 25 years.
Okay. Is there anyone with any last points? You might be just sitting there thinking, I've still haven't got a clue what you're talking about, and ask a very simple question. So, yeah, the lady there.
Hi, I'm just trying to comprehend what Erik and James said in one context. Erik said that we have 4 tons of fossil fuels we already need, that we have the fossil fuels that we need. And I share James' passion that you won the challenge, but I'm wondering what's the urgency to go into fracking? Is it just because we can't do it, or is there a necessary need to do fracking at this point?
That's the sort of question I'm looking for. Did you want to say something?
mainly about response to this lady over here talking about environmental despoilation. The area where I live, it used to be canals, coal mines, railways, and everything like that. I can imagine a period when the sky was black. Now all that stuff's redundant. It's beautiful in a natural kind of way. Quite like railways and coal mines.
Just a quick question on the statistics that James had on that slide. Has anyone actually been harmed as a result of drinking toxic water as a result of fracking?
Right. Is everyone happy that we've put them on the spot enough? I think I'll now move to the panel to sum up, and I think we're going in reverse order, starting with Tony.
Thank you. Just a couple of, firstly, a couple of reactions to points that have been made. Somebody talked about problems of water contamination and shale gases have got a great depth and it's deeper than in the US. It is deeper than in the US. It may be 2 or 3 kilometres down. That doesn't mean there isn't a problem, but also the other form of unconventional gas that the companies are looking to extract, including iGas, not many miles from here at Barton, over near Eccles, is coal bed methane, and that's typically a lot shallower. That might only be 500 metres down, and you're bringing the same problems of contaminated water there. The lady who asked about the impacts of fracking on a small island like the UK, I think their concerns are real. The US is a much larger country. We are a much more densely packed country, and there are real problems. One of the things is, in Australia, they put in New South Wales, they put in an exclusion zone. They've said they're not allowing any coal bed methane extraction within 2 kilometres of any residential area. If you put something like that on in the UK, there'd be just about nowhere where you could do anything. We are a much more densely packed island, and that is going to cause big problems. It's going to cause problems for trying to locate the industry because people are going to be concerned, and it's going to cause additional costs for the industry. People talk about, I've said the regulation will be more robust in the UK than in the US, and that we can regulate the industry into safety. They said that in Australia. They said we will have more robust regulations than the US, we will regulate the industry into safety, and they've had a similar scale of problems to what they've had in the US. You cannot regulate this industry into safety. The nature of the industry means that. You can make it safer, but you cannot make it safe. And then just, if I can, just a couple of brief points in conclusion. There's been a lot mentioned about the International Energy Agency. I think most of us have mentioned this at one point or another. So here's my quote from the International Energy Agency, from Fateh Birol, who the gentleman down here mentioned. This is an International Energy Agency. It's an intergovernmental body. It brings together, it's sort of like the OECD of energy. And then Fateh Birol, the chief economist of the International Energy Agency, said, shale gas is not the optimum path. The optimum path is energy-saving, renewables, and low-carbon technology. He's right. That is exactly the right path. And just my very final comment, it's a quote from David Mackay, who is the Department of Energy and Climate Change's chief scientific advisor. A comment about climate change. He said, without any global climate policies, new fossil fuel exploitation is likely to lead to an increase in greenhouse gas emissions and the risk of climate change. I think given what we saw last week in the report for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, given what we've heard about the risks of climate change, that additional fossil fuel extraction is something we should be simply avoiding. Leave the stuff in the ground.
Give me a round of applause.
So the lady who was saying what else, what comes up really with the fracking mod, it's mining minerals. So it's not just gas and oil products. So it'll go into loads of different manufacturing industries. But one of the main ones will actually be the metal industry, which has actually been financially unstable for decades. So we'll basically be able to put those products into our own jewellery, and also technology, so we can either sort of source ourselves out or even actually create stuff and sell it abroad. So there's lots of different goodies down there. It's not just gas and oil. Okay.
Yeah, I just want to make two very brief points. The first has to do with the arguments you're going to hear from here, and if you haven't heard them already, from the industry. They're going to say, It's a stopgap. It's not, you know, we're not saying it's the whole answer, but it's much better than coal and oil because it's only 50% of greenhouse gas, the amount of energy that burn. And I think I've said quite a lot, and Tony and a few of you have said, but I just want to read a brief quote from this Cornell University team. These are not lefty green, they are academics who have spent their lives looking at the way you extract minerals out of the ground. And they say the large greenhouse gas footprint of shale gas undercuts the logic of its use as a bridging fuel over coming decades if the goal is to reduce global warming. We don't intend that our study be used to justify the continuing use of either oil or coal, but rather to demonstrate that by substituting shale gas for these other fossil fuels, this may not have the desired effect of mitigating climate warming. And these are people who are neutral academics, and I think that makes the point really, really well. On the issue of the lights will go out, which is the other thing we hear quite a lot, you only have to look around in recent history in California, where economic turmoil caused brownouts and power cuts, and also more recently after Fukushima, when the Japanese decided to shut all of their nuclear power stations off. In both cases, people miraculously managed to save over 20% of the entire consumption of that state and country. And they're fine, they're carrying on. All right, maybe some of the things they'd like to do aren't happening anymore, but it is entirely possible. In fact, the estimate is 30% of the energy that we consume is entirely wasted and can be remedied tomorrow by all of us. I just finished doing an experiment in our energy house at Salford University, which is a facility where we can experiment on a building inside an environment chamber. I found that simply by the way that we go about our business in our homes, we can save 66% of our entire energy bill. And that's simply by just paying attention to what the boiler controls are and not throwing the window open while the centrals are. You know, it is entirely possible. And the final point I want to make is really to turn to James and his comments when he was talking about the precautionary principle. I think I heard you right, James, and saying this is not a great idea, especially for the EU, because it squashes innovation. It's scaredy cat mentality. You know, we'd never do anything if we operated the precautionary principle, which fundamentally misunderstands the nature of that approach. The precautionary principle is you continuing to pay your fire insurance on your house. I could ask every single one of you, do you think your house is going to burn down today? Is it going to burn down tomorrow? How about next week? Each time you're going to say, no, absolutely not. I take all the trouble. Why are you wasting your money? That doesn't make any sense. Save it. Go on holiday somewhere. Don't bother. But you will carry on, if you can afford it, of course, carry on paying your fire insurance. Why? Because the implications of not stopping what the great majority of the scientific community is saying is crazy to continue to do. The implications of carrying on is so awful that if they are all wrong and actually everything's going to be fine, we'll have wasted a tiny amount of our GDP. If we do the opposite, climate scientists are saying we will go extinct.
Now, speaking of somebody whose house did burn down, I'm not sure about the analogy. James.
Well, I very much enjoyed the debate, and let me say that apart from a bit of psychobabble about dependency and addiction was hinted at, I suppose, and denials, it's been remarkably free of the cant and posturing and name-calling that often attends environmental discussions. So for that, I'm very grateful to the Manchester Salon, and if anybody deserves a round of applause, it's Simon Bell who organised it. I just want to say that Britain is different from America, and that is a reasonable point to make. I wonder if people know just exactly what percentage of Britain's surface area is urbanised. The answer is 10% max, and the percent that's occupied by residential property is under 2%. So without fracking in Snowdonia, because it's probably unsightly and it won't do the National Trust any good or any of that, there is plenty of room to do fracking in, not on the same scale as the United States, but to say that we're overcrowded or to point to immigration being a problem really doesn't do justice to the facts. Was it something I said? Oh no, you're not leaving. So I think we need to keep an open mind on all of these things, and this was a brilliant hero of mine who was one of the founders of alternating current. He was a 4'6" hunchback Silesian Marxist dwarf, terrific man actually, and so I'm pleased about the openness of debate, although somebody here is everything all right? Oh right, great. Now, Fatih Birol, who makes a wonderful anagram if you want him, he's not the director of the IEA actually, you should get it right, he's a chief economist. No, you said that he was the you said he was the chief economist, he said he was the director. As it happens, I was at the press conference that launched the report that you're all quoting, where the IEA devotes a whole chapter to energy efficiency. And, you know, I just want to say that, again on the Holiday Inn, they're in the same game. You know, the IEA agrees, the EU agrees, Friends of the Earth agree, Holiday Inn agrees that the way forward in energy is to save it, not to innovate it. I think this is profoundly demoralising for the human race. The Holiday Inn mentality will not close the energy gap that is around, and we do need to close that gap. You will not really go very far, Erik, with the Jimmy Carter put on a sweater mentality. If you want me or you to go around the house switching everything off, having a cooler bath, having a cooler shower, a shorter shower, putting on a sweater, metering things and doing all of that, we'll go right ahead. But you know, I'd rather see a movie or debate philosophy or come to the Manchester Salon. You know, the point about energy is innovation is that we need not to consider energy if at all possible, and if it's all done by engineers and we don't have to argue about it or think about it or fiddle with it all day long, it'll be a great thing. With our environmentalist friends, of course, we should be obsessed about it all the time. We should follow the Germans and build crowdfunding sources and you know, spend most of our time thinking about energy. Now the water question has been very important, and I do think maybe we could have a salon all about water. Actually, perhaps you'd like to speak there. The biggest problem for water is actually in China, especially in the Tarim Desert, which is very dry in the northwest of China. If you look at the numbers, the Chinese, I don't think, will by any means achieve their target, not with the Chinese Communist Party in charge, of 100 billion cubic meters of shale gas a year. But if you look at what that involves, it's 1 billion cubic meters of water. China right now has 600 billion cubic meters consumption, and the state hopes for an upper limit of 700 billion cubic meters. So even in China, which is way drier than Britain, there is more than enough water to handle the shale gas phenomenon. Not it definitely was something I said. So I hope you'll buy, I can't answer all the questions, I hope you'll buy my book. It's usually $12.99, it's now at $7. And let me just conclude by saying, in certain cases, definitely no fracking. But the very interesting point is what happens. By the colleague in the blue shirt there, you know, I think the anti-frackers have rallied to that. I think the anti-frackers have rallied to that cause because they see it as a soft way of getting people in Balcombe and elsewhere on the side of those against climate change. Now, I'm against climate change, but it's not going to do the struggle against climate change any favours by trying to corral people and going on about radioactive water, fires coming out of your taps, and all the other things that people say. Fracking won't create jobs, and green energy won't create jobs unless you want everybody to get up in the loft and be very labour intensive all the time. So we do need those experiments, we do need that innovation, and we do need progress in energy supply. We do have a lot of oil and gas in the world, but in Britain to close the energy gap, fracking might be very useful in all of that. That's the nuance I would put on that. Yes, there's a lot out there. More's being discovered offshore all the time. Do we have it in Britain? No, North Sea gas and oil are running out there, and therefore on land sources would be useful. Progress is more important than the manipulations of the big six. I already made the point I don't think they'll lower the prices. I'm sure there'll be many shenanigans when the big six and quadrilla do fracking, but the point is the principle of technological advance so that we don't spend all our time fiddling around, unplugging things and worrying about the wrong kind of stuff in life. Thank you so much.